Welcome back to Shadows of the Past, where we shine our light on the shadows of history. I have to start today's episode asking you to listen closely. Do you hear that? The reverberation of an unknowable amount of particles rubbing together, all in a cooperative concerto. The gentle pad of nature's murmur filling the portions of chaotic silence. The swelling symphonies of the stars growing over you until you feel your body begin to sway, and you begin your dance of euphoria, each motion matching the timpani of the trees. And as you dance, you find it, release, salvation, maybe even the divine. Your muscles begin to slightly ache, a remembrance that you're still alive, still a part of this cosmic concord. Eventually, after you've let your pain drift through your twirling limbs, you begin to tire. And soon this dance comes to an end. Or does it? What if you couldn't stop? What if you were locked there in an endless pirouette? The star sonata now turning into discord. Your muscles now aching from overuse. Exhaustion causing you to want to drop. But you can't. The dance must continue. At least until you actually drop. Well, drop dead, that is. This is something that happened to hundreds in a French city in the medieval era. I'll go over the events that transpired and the possible reason for this rigorous romp. And of course, you'll get my opinion at the end. Now come with me and delve into the shadows. This all begins in 1518 in Strasbourg, France. The town has already been met with some interesting occurrences, starting with a white-hot star streaking across the sky. But there would be more. Fields would flood, and eventually violent temperature changes would cause misery and hunger. And it was here where Frau Trophy first stepped out of the setting and into the town streets, and began her dance macabre. She would hop around, moving to some silent song, the cloth of her dress gently swaying to each decisive movement. And it was quite the sight, whether out of morbid curiosity or the want to join in on the festivities. Onlookers began to form, which, not going to lie, if I see someone just dancing in the middle of the streets, I'm gonna think, man, there's someone who had a good time at the bar, especially if they have that drunken baby dance going on. Her husband would beg and plead for her to stop and come home, but to no avail. She would continue this into the wee hours of the nights until her body collapsed from exhaustion. And after she stirred with the setting sun, she would begin the dance again, her swollen and aching feet pounding the ground to the muted tempo of her heart. And over time, one by one, some of the onlookers joined in. By the end of the week, 3 dozen had joined in the horrid dance, their sweaty faces set in rigor, a contrast to the festive dance going on beneath their tortured visages. The authorities would begin to grow scared as the number of dancers swelled. They decided to extract the progenitor of this frightening frolic, taking Frau away in a horse-drawn carriage. There was a sainted shrine in Saverne that might be the key to upending this epidemic. And so she was sent to receive the blessing of Saint Vitus, his curse believed to be on this poor girl. During this time, local physicians told authorities that the dancers had blood that had become overheated. Usually, the doctors would bleed out the patient's fiery blood, which around those times was honestly the solution to most things. But that solution wouldn't quite work this time. Be a bit dangerous getting that sample. The dancers will just need to dance out that bad blood. Bleed it out or walk it off. What are these physicians, my father? And so workers were brought in to rebuild the grain and horse markets into a giant dance floor. They even brought in a band and fake dancers. Because if we know anything, live music calms people. And if the people wanted a party, they were going to bring the party, until the people danced the devil out of those shredded souls. As you can imagine, this went terribly. Being more inclined to supernatural belief, this would only whip the people up into more of a frenzy. This had to be the true power of Saint Vitus in play, cursed for their wrongful sins. And since almost none were without sin, more joined in on the dance. By the end of the month, over 400 would be gyrating to the saint's song, many collapsing in heaps under the duress of their body. The authorities quickly realized this was a crap idea and quickly disassembled the dance floor. And this is where they got to the point that most authorities start with: containment. Maybe if they just hide the dancers, it'll quickly die out. In fact, they would just ban dancing altogether. Music too, because surely the people wouldn't dance if there was a law in place. This really just became medieval Footloose. But there was one instrument that got to be the exception: stringed instruments. Cause, Guts really hit that harmonious angelic frequency. Lute, you can stay. Tambourine, get the f*** out of here. Harpsichord, I'm watching you. I swear if you even boogie, you're out. And while this was going on, Frau had arrived at the shrine. There before her, wrapped in flames, was Saint Vitus, represented as a blond man in a cauldron, sometimes with a raven or a lion. The cauldron was here due to the miracle that would grant him his sainthood. In his legend, Vitus was thrown in a cauldron of searing tar and molten lead, enough to flash fry anyone. But Vitus would go unscathed. He would later be tortured and whisked away by an angel, succumbing to the injuries. And for this, he was worshipped as the patron saint of dance? The only reason that I could find is that it might be a holdover from when people worshipped the god of light. Vitus would come to replace this god as a symbol of reverence, and many would come to frolic and celebrate in front of the wooden statue. Frau was there for, unfortunately, much more dire circumstances. The authorities long believed the saint had cursed the village, long associated with rheumatic chorea, also known as Saint Vitus dance, where those suffering make uncontrollable, jerky movements with their head and limbs. An almost gleeful way to describe such a debilitating condition. Similar but smaller scale outbreaks occurred before this, and like always, it was a punishment for our sins. Frau would be handed 2 small wooden crosses. They would also attempt to put special red shoes on her feet. They had been blessed with holy water and consecrated oil, the air rife with smells of incense and rhythmic incantations. And I don't think they meant to do this, but stick some lights on those crosses and you instantly got a Renaissance rave. Alright, here we go. Somehow, all this worked, and many more were carried off to the shrine. And if it didn't, then they weren't long for this world. It was reported that as many as 15 people were dying a day all the way into August. But so far, no death records have substantiated this claim. There could have been no deaths whatsoever if the records were correct. But it's hard to believe that a group of people who are already starving and in poor health would not go untouched from this epidemic. And just like how the people were probably asking God how this was happening, you're asking yourself a similar question. And there's been a few who have tried to answer it. None of it conclusive, but I believe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Let's start out with the respected alchemist and philosopher of the time, Paracelsus, who apparently did not give the same respect to women. He said Frau was making it up to get at her husband, and so all the other women decided to join up and say screw it to their husbands too. Jesus, Paracelsus, who are you? You'll make it someday there, buddy. That someday being a Saturday in 1514 when he died. But I digress. It was noted a myriad of times that the dancers had a pained expression on their face. No one wanted to be doing this, but still felt compelled, drawn like a moth to the ever-swelling flame. We now get into more modern and less misogynistic theories. Historians have offered the cause being ergot. Ergot. Ergot? Ergot. Ergot. Ergot.
Ergot. Ergot.
It's a type of fungi that grows in grains when they are damp, possibly passing on to their bread. Ergot is closely related to LSD and has its own psychoactive properties. There would be jerking movements to accompany this. It would also be related to an illness of another saint, St. Anthony's Fire. But there was a historian that debunked this in his own book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die. This man being John Waller. He would explain that ergot restricts blood flow to the extremities, the same ones that were flailing around like crazy. It wouldn't be possible, especially for several days straight. He thought it might have something less to do with the body and more with the mind. Mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria to be exact. He first noted the setting for all this to happen. It was a time of extreme duress, the ominous star appearing, then bouts of famine, frigid cold, and scorching summers all leaving the people hungry and slowly diminishing from malnutrition. They also had to deal with a series of plagues, smallpox and leprosy eroding their bodies, while syphilis would sap their minds. A desperate people at the end of their ropes. There was a precedent already set for this. There had been many dancing epidemics, primarily around Strasbourg, and many already knew of St. Vitus' curse, to uncontrollably move your own body in rhythmic dance with no volition of your own. So with all this together, the people would manifest the curse into reality, a sickness of the mind now coursing down into their bodies. And we can draw a plethora of parallels. The first are the trance states that some cultures in Brazil and Madagascar enter into during ceremonies. Usually this is also done under a time of duress, and is used to help fade the pain and stress currently being inflicted upon the victim. Also not too far from speaking in tongues like certain Christian groups while having their own pains driven out in a physical way. There's two more that I thought were worth noting. One is the most extreme. In 1967 in Singapore, it was noted in Singapore Medical Journal that a Coro outbreak had happened. What's that, you ask? Why, thank you. How kind. Oh, it's just the irrational fear of your penis being stolen or shrinking. The men would secure their meat with clamps and poles, hoping the zucchini thief would not visit them in the night. The other is a laughing outbreak that happened in 1962 in Tanzania. A few girls in a boarding school started laughing uncontrollably one day after hearing a joke. What seemed like a good time all around soon turned sour as they didn't stop laughing for days. They would also, unfortunately, suffer. Between the pain from their overworked muscles to the respiratory problems from their overworked lungs, the girls would end up fainting or going into crying attacks. And it wouldn't end there though. It would actually spread beyond the school into the neighboring villages. It lasted 18 months total, with several hundred cases being recorded by doctors. The laughter would usually fade after a week. It must have been a hell of a joke. I wish I could have heard it. I bet it was this one. Two fish were inside a tank. One turns to the other and says, "How do I drive this thing?" Gets me every time. But this happens enough that we can start to see the patterns. The victims usually being people that are completely powerless and suffering miserably with no way to express themselves. And so they turn to doing it with their bodies instead. A compulsion, but also a way to show that inner suffering in an outward way. And since many were feeling that misery, many would subconsciously join in. We even got it here in the US with the Salem witch trials. We're still not above our herd mentality. People react to stress in crazy ways, just like caged animals. Go figure. I feel like we're seeing people act out more and more with the pains of technology, society, and wealth. With each passing day where it feels like we're living in a 70s dystopian sci-fi novel, I get why people sometimes need to alleviate the crushing burden of existence. A valve of negative pressure being turned and finally released. But holy shit, some of you really need to chill. You know who you are. But I think it might be somewhere in the middle. Remember that rheumatic chorea I mentioned earlier? The dancing illness? It can be caused by a certain type of bacteria called Streptococcus. What if someone, say, got infected with the bacteria and then mixed with everything else going on at the time between the famines and weather, people decided to act out under the cursed condition, actually believing themselves to be under St. Vitus' haunted hex? I could actually see it happening. More of a mixture of the two ideas, just throwing out the ergot entirely. But honestly, even without the bacterial component, there's enough evidence to link it to good old mass psychogenic illness alone. And I fear as we march forward, the pains don't look like they're going to alleviate anytime soon. And I fear we're only going to get more people acting even more bananas. An outdated society trying to keep up with the march of the machine while slowly being crushed underfoot. And I hope that the pain will alleviate someday, and we can dance because we want to, not because we feel forced to. Thank you for delving into Shadows with me today. Goodbye. So I know you guys are probably wondering about this. Well, I was starting to shave and it got a little bit too close, and then all of a sudden the shaver tasted blood, then attacked me furiously. Like an angry creature, it just came with the buzzing sound of 1,000,000 bees and the blood-curdling frenzy of 1,000 bears. But don't worry, I kicked his ass.